Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. We last left North America on the precipice of a war for the survival of two polities. A young United States of America was having its citizens captured on the high seas, and its trading policy governed by a foreign power. She needed to stand up to her old colonial master and assert herself on the global stage, lest she be forever the prodigal son of the great empire. British North America, on the other hand, was at risk of being swallowed up by her aggressive southern neighbor, who was already expanding westward past her agreed-upon borders. And America's wayward children were already among the elites of British North America's nascent cities, intertwining the economies and cultures of the two peoples. The upcoming conflict would be ugly for many who desired peace. In June of 1812, the Democratic-Republican Party in the American Congress supported President Madison's request for a declaration of war with 60% of the votes. The Federalist Party opposed the war at the outset and continued to oppose it throughout the conflict. This war largely meant the end of the Federalist Party, as there are few things that Americans support more than an unnecessary conflict. It took 8 days for news of the declaration of war to reach the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and another 2 weeks to reach London. Curiously, despite both parties seeing it coming, neither belligerent party in North America was ready to fight a war, so both went about the process of readying themselves after the war was declared. With the British and Americans now at war, this put the Haudenosaunee in a bit of a pickle, as they held territory in Upper Canada that was coveted by the Americans, and territory in New York State that was within striking distance of British and Canadian forces. The Indian Department of the United States sent envoys to the Six Nations in New York and surreptitiously to their extended co-nationals in British North America. They insisted that the United States would win this war in short order without the need for help from the Haudenosaunee, and that if any of their numbers broke faith with the great Father Madison, then their whole nation would suffer for it. 2 of these conditions came true. The Americans did not win the war in short order without the help of the Indigenous allies. Some, though not all, supported their British allies against the Americans, and their whole nation would suffer in the peace at war's end. For the Algonquin and other Anishinaabe in the Ottawa Valley and the northern Great Lakes, there was no immediate threat of dual loyalty, as they were allies of the British, a distant neighbor to the Americans. The Algonquin mustered support for the British against the Americans in Lower Canada, alongside the Innu and other minor Iroquois and Anishinaabe factions, the Wendat, Odawa, and Ojibwe in the northern Great Lakes, and the Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga in the southern Great Lakes. The war started on 12 July with General William Hull leading his unprepared American soldiers across the river from Fort Detroit to attack the equally unprepared British garrison at the town of Sandwich, modern-day Windsor. He ordered all British subjects to surrender. The British garrison did not surrender, but instead fought a chaotic campaign for 2 months until 7 August, when Hull returned to Detroit and left his 600 troops to keep fighting the good fight under one of his subordinates. A large British force, commanded by Major General Isaac Brock, arrived to reinforce Sandwich shortly thereafter and successfully took Fort Detroit on 16 August, while Hull and his forces retreated towards Fort Wayne, but were ambushed and killed along the way by Potawatomi militias, an Anishinaabe nation allied with the Odawa. In October, Americans crossed the Niagara River and were met with resistance from British, Canadian militia, and Six Nation forces. Fortunately for the defenders, the Niagara Peninsula, and particularly the Niagara Escarpment around the falls, would prove to be difficult for set-piece troops, and lent itself to the kind of hit-and-run guerrilla style at which the Haudenosaunee excelled. Muskets were technically capable of killing at 300 yards, but anything over 100 was a bit of a roll of the dice. It took just under 30 seconds for a trained soldier to reload, so after a shot, an infantryman is an open target for half a minute while they reload. A normal person who works out irregularly should be able to run 150 yards in 30 seconds to make up that distance. And at this situation, the runners are exceptionally motivated to close that distance. On the open fields of Europe, this was the way of things. But in the forests and hills of Niagara, where soldiers wouldn't necessarily see their enemies until they were close enough to charge with swords and tomahawks, this created a frightful and violent situation. The Americans were defeated in the forests of the escarpment at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October, and retreated to their side of the river, leaving almost 1,000 captured and 100 killed. The much-vaunted General Brock was shot and killed in the battle, however, only to become a hero in the Canadian narrative of the war. The lack of American success in 1812 did not mean that the war was a failure, as it would continue in 1813, 1814, and even 1815. I will restate my complaint that we need to have a better name for this war. On a related note, the 100 Years' War lasted for 116 years. And the guinea pig is not from Guinea, nor is it a pig. In April of 1813, American naval forces left Sackett's Harbor, New York, and in sequence attacked Kingston, York, and Fort George at the mouth of the Niagara. While the Americans had the force to attack, sack, and crack British defenders around Lake Ontario, they didn't have enough of a force to hold any of those conquests, particularly the towns of Kingston and York. Under the magnificently named Zebulon Pike, York was held from the 26th of April to the 2nd of May, barely a week. The Americans looted the barracks, but left the civilian populace alone, but would raid again in July and plunder food and military supplies from the town itself. They would return again in August of 1814. They would return again in August of 1814, notice that the British had finally established some more serious defenses, and then return to the waters of the lake. After the first round of victories in April of 1813, the American forces marched from the captured Fort George to launch a surprise attack on Fort Beaver Dams, deep in the Niagara Peninsula, to secure the territory between Lakes Erie and Ontario. The Americans marched 600 regulars against the 50 British regulars, who had been warned of their coming by Chocolate Muse Laura Secord. The significance of the British victory at Beaver Dams came not from the thwarted element of surprise. Surprise or not, it was still 12-1, but because of the 400 Indigenous warriors that earned the victory. This would represent one of the last times where Mohawks would fight a battle as Mohawks, not as soldiers in another's army. Of the 600 American regulars, 512 were captured and 25 killed. Only 63 survivors managed to make it back to Fort George to tell the tale. The battles of Kingston, York, Fort George, and Beaver Dams were the western part of the St. Lawrence front of the war. U.S. Secretary of War John Armstrong had made the decision that if the Americans could control the choke point of the St. Lawrence, then all of Upper Canada would fall to the American forces. So the decision was made to move towards Montreal and sever the artery that connected Upper Canada to the sea and to British supplies and reinforcements. The problem with that is that support for the war was dreadful in New England and overtly hostile in New York State. New York militias refused to leave the state, and there was a fear that federal troops would be unsafe trekking across to make war. Armstrong ordered a regiment of 2,600 regulars and 1,400 New York militiamen to cross New York State at such a speed that they would not encounter any resistance from the locals, and hopefully arrive in Lower Canada with an element of surprise. When they arrived at Lake Champlain to transport up the Richelieu towards Montreal, the New York militiamen refused to go, insisting that it was their duty to defend their state, not to make war on their neighbors. The 2,600 regulars proceeded to invade Lower Canada, marching across southern Quebec towards Montreal. Rather than take the Richelieu River, as had been done by the French, British, Haudenosaunee, and Patriot armies in the past, They took a stretch overland towards Montreal, rather than follow the Richelieu to its mouth at the St. Lawrence, east to Montreal. This was before the swamps of the region were drained for the construction of farmland during the Second World War, so the cold and rainy march through the swamps must have been quite the experience for the Americans. They trudged through the muddy autumn, unmolested by any resistance, until they crossed the Chateauguay River near Ormstown. It shouldn't be incredulous to hear that Lower Canada, modern Quebec, had a bit of an ambivalent relationship towards the English over the years. In 1813, New France was still in the living memory of some of the old-timers, and young people would have heard about the English invaders from their grandparents. Quebec City fell in 1759, and France surrendered their North American holdings in 1763, only 50 and 54 years ago. French speakers and practicing Catholics were allowed some freedoms by their British governors, but not as much as their own people were. Convincing French Canadians to voluntarily enlist in and protect the British Empire was going to be a hard sell. Convincing them to sign up and resist another set of invaders would be an easier prospect, though. Enter a fils de France, Charles Michel de Rumbery de Salaberry, a son, a grandson, a great-grandson, a great-great-grandson of the seigneuries of Lower Canada, Quebec before then, and Nouvelle-France before that. He was born in 1778, a mere 19 into the British occupation, and 2 years after the American withdrawal from Quebec during the American War of Independence. He was a veteran of the British Army, having served in Ireland and the Caribbean. He was even a close personal friend of George III's son, Prince Edward, who'd eventually get an island province named after him. Salaberry was entrusted to raise a regiment of French-Canadian volunteers in 1812, just before the war, and to train them for defending Lower Canada in the event of an invasion from the south. The regiment that he trained were light infantry, called les Voltigeurs Canadiens. The Voltigeurs, alongside just under 200 Indigenous militiamen, mostly Mohawk from Kanawake and Kanesatake, but also including several Algonquin from the Ottawa Valley, including a young Pierre-Louis Constant Pinessé, a future Algonquin chief who will be the feature of a future episode. The Voltigeur forces harassed the larger American host and forced a retreat after attacking them in a ravine and compelling them to return to New York State at the Battle of the Chateauguay. In The Making of Canada, Greg Cable makes the argument that this was what should have been the Canadian victory of the War of 1812. Upper Canada was fought by British regulars, then their Indigenous allies, with minor support from local militias. The assault on Washington was by British regulars. Chateauguay was Canadians defending Canada on their own, without British regular support. I have to concur that if these were English-speaking soldiers, they'd probably be more of a part of the English-Canada myth of the national origin. 2 weeks later, the veterans of Chateauguay, reinforced with dragoons and other regular troops from Upper Canada, attacked the high command of the American St. Lawrence Theatre near modern Morrisburg, Ontario, in what would be called the Battle of Chrysler's Field, capturing a supply depot and scuttling the American ships in nearby Sackett's Harbor. This victory forced both sides into winter quarters, as nobody was going to fight a war in the winter, and made the Americans abandon the St. Lawrence campaign. The war continued, focusing more on the south and away from our focus on the northern U.S. border. The British laid siege to Baltimore, inspiring Francis Scott Key to compose the Star-Spangled Banner, which would become the official American national anthem in 1931, and burned down the presidential palace, forcing it to be whitewashed and earning the moniker the White House. On Christmas Eve, 24 December 1814, in the city of Ghent, in the United Netherlands, a treaty was signed ending the conflict and restoring peace to North America. This being the days before instant telecommunications, the final battle took place 2 weeks later, in the Battle of New Orleans. The status quo ante bellum, or the state of affairs before the war, was restored. The British lost 10,000 men and the Americans 15,000, of which 1,960 and 3,721 died in combat. That's 19.6% of the British and 25% of the American fatalities. The rest were from disease, wounds, and exposure. All to restore the status quo of before the horrible, unnecessary, inevitable war. In terms of winners and losers, the U.S. met most of its war aims, securing the northern border, ending impressment, and opening European trade. So they can claim a victory. The British kept their presence in North America, securing their southern border with the United States, and so met their war aims as well. I don't know if both sides won, but certainly neither country lost. Indigenous North Americans lost. Before and during the war, those independent nations made alliances with the great powers and defended their territory against interlopers. At war's end, they had lost the capacity of military might or demographic strength to stand up to what was the United States or what would be Canada. They lost between 7,000 and 10,000 warriors, numbers they could ill afford to lose. The St. Lawrence Campaign convinced the British authorities that there would be a need to defend the Great Lakes from another American invasion, and that could best be done by opening up the old fur trade route of the Ottawa River. By taking the Ottawa River instead of the St. Lawrence, trade could continue safely in the event of another war. The Mattawa portage between the Ottawa River and Lake Nipissing would be developed, then Lake Superior and Huron could be connected to the Ottawa, then down to Montreal in the Atlantic, and the largest civil engineering project in the Americas to date would begin making a canal system to connect Lake Ontario from Kingston, up the Cataraqui River to Great Rideau Lake, then down the Rideau River to Ottawa. In order to accomplish this, a new military depot would need to be established at the end of this canal system, across the Ottawa from Wrightstown in Hull Township. This new and yet unnamed town would be essential for maintaining the British presence in North America. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Next week, we'll be taking the week off for March break. As an educator and a parent, I'm taking family time. Don't look at me like that. I'm allowed. The following week, we're going to meet a young British Lieutenant Colonel by the name of John By, who was maligned in his day and celebrated long after his death. In the meantime, if you'd like to see some other resources about the inappropriately named War of 1812, please take a look at the website at ottawahistoryhub.com. You can contact me at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or on Blue Sky as the Ottawa History Hub or on X Twitter as Hot History Hub. Until then, advance Ottawa, en avant!